His grandpa taught him how to build, but the last lesson was silent. The first thing he ever built was a crooked birdhouse with one missing nail and a roof that wouldn't sit straight. But his grandpa said, "Good, now let's do it again." Before we begin, make sure to subscribe if you love meaningful stories, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I really enjoy seeing where these stories travel. Luke was 5 when he first walked into the garage, holding a peanut butter sandwich in one hand and dragging a chair with the other. The garage smelled like sawdust and motor oil. The floor was stained in places that didn't scrub clean anymore. The bench along the wall was covered in neatly sorted jars, screws, nails, washers, bolts, each one labeled in Grandpa's careful block handwriting. He didn't remember much about those early Saturdays, not in detail. Just the rhythm, the way Grandpa didn't say much but always handed him something to do. Sand this. Hold that. Try again. There were no instructions taped to the wall. No talking unless it mattered. But Luke learned. One board at a time. Grandpa didn't do soft. He wasn't a hugger. He wasn't the kind of man who knelt to a child's level. He spoke in one-word replies, grunted approval, handed over tools without eye contact. But in that garage, Luke never felt ignored. Every motion had meaning. Every project, even the messy ones, had a purpose. And every Saturday, without fail, the garage door was open when he arrived. When Luke turned 8, they built a workbench together. Smaller than the main one, but sturdy. Grandpa stood behind him the whole time, guiding his hands without moving them. When Luke cracked a board by driving the screw too deep, Grandpa didn't scold. He just said, "Do it again." They didn't throw anything away. Mistakes stayed on the wall. By 11, Luke could measure and cut without being asked. Could align corners by feel. Could tell the difference between pine and oak by the smell. Saturdays became habit. Morning sandwich. Bike ride across town. Projects that started as repairs and ended as lessons. They never talked about school. Never talked about friends. Just wood and metal and getting it right the second time if the first didn't hold. And when Luke got older, when his voice changed and his jeans got longer, nothing in the garage changed. The radio still played the same old country station. The light still flickered near the back shelf. And Grandpa still handed him tools like he always had. Sometimes they'd go all afternoon without saying 10 words. It never felt empty. Luke started bringing things of his own, an old skateboard he wanted to fix, a picture frame that needed gluing, a rusted tool from a neighbor's shed. Grandpa would nod. Always let him try first. Always corrected with his hands, not his mouth. One winter, Luke came in with frozen fingers and a broken flashlight. Grandpa handed him a mug of coffee. No sugar, no warning. Luke took one sip, coughed, and then drank it anyway. Grandpa just went back to sanding the edge of a cabinet door, not looking up once. That was their rhythm. Work first, talk if you needed to. And somehow, without saying it, Luke learned how to build. Not just things, but patience, precision, presence. He learned that wood didn't lie if you listened, that a good joint didn't need extra glue, that sometimes the best fix was just taking it apart and starting over. By the time Luke was 16, he didn't ask questions anymore. He just showed up, pulled the chain on the overhead light, and got to work. The birdhouse still sat on a high shelf in the back corner, crooked roof and all. It wasn't much to look at, but it never fell apart. The hammer never changed. Same weight, same chipped handle wrapped in faded black tape, same dent in the head from something Grandpa swore was a roofing job back in '84. Luke used it every Saturday. Never asked for a newer one. Never needed to. It worked. That was enough. He was 17 now, taller than his grandpa, voice deeper, hands stronger. But when he stepped into the garage, Nothing about him tried to take up more space. The rules were the same. Tools returned to the exact place on the pegboard. No junk left on the workbench. Sweep the floor before you leave. Grandpa didn't talk much these days. He didn't move as quickly either. When Luke arrived, he usually found him already sitting on the stool by the far window, sorting nails into old coffee cans or rubbing his thumb over the edge of a scrap of sandpaper. His eyes were slower to follow conversation. His hands shook just a little when he lifted his mug. But he was still sharp, still knew where everything was, still barked wrong clamp if Luke reached for the wrong one, still nodded when a cut was clean, when the wood sat flush. The garage hadn't changed. Same jars lined the shelf, labeled in block letters, same tape measure hanging from the hook, same radio, volume low, set to the country station no one remembered choosing. Their projects were different now. Less building, more fixing. An old cabinet door from a neighbor's kitchen. A cracked fence board. A drawer that stuck too far out. But the rhythm was still there. A project came in. They worked. They didn't rush. And when it was done right. Luke noticed the shifts, though. Grandpa's hands took longer to tighten a bolt, his grip weaker on the driver. Sometimes he'd squint harder at the level, blink a few times, then hand it to Luke and say, "You check it." Luke didn't say anything about it. He just nodded, checked it, passed it back. One Saturday in late spring, they rebuilt the corner shelves above the old grinder. The wood had warped over time. Grandpa insisted it was time to fix it. Luke offered to do it himself, but Grandpa just waved him off. They cut new supports together. Grandpa leaned more than he stood. Luke measured twice, sometimes 3 times, knowing Grandpa would still glance at every mark. When it was done, they stood back and looked at it. Grandpa nodded once, then turned away. The next week, he didn't open the garage. Luke knocked once, then let himself in through the side door. Grandpa was sitting at the kitchen table, his cane leaning against the wall, his coffee gone cold. He looked up and said nothing, just pointed toward the garage and said, "You know what to do." So Luke went in, turned on the lights, and started without him. It felt strange, the silence. Not the usual kind, not the quiet they were used to. It was heavier. He worked for 2 hours, sanding an old dresser drawer, tightening loose joints, aligning a warped panel. He kept glancing at the door. It never opened. That became the new routine. Luke showed up, worked. Grandpa stayed inside. Some days he came out for a minute just to look, nod, and go back in. Other days, he didn't appear at all. But the lights were always on. The mug always sat by the window. The tools were never out of place. Luke never asked why. He just kept showing up. Same time, same place, same hammer. Because that's how he'd been taught. You build, you fix, you show up. Even when the person who taught you is slowly learning how to let go. The knock on the garage door went unanswered for the first time in years. Luke stood there for a moment, hands still resting on the faded wood, listening for the familiar shuffle of boots or the low creak of the old hinges. Nothing. No footsteps. No radio. Just the distant sound of birds and the hum of a lawnmower 3 houses down. He walked around to the side door and let himself in. The kitchen was dim, blinds half closed against the morning sun. The air smelled faintly of toast and old coffee. Grandpa's truck was parked out front, keys still on the hook by the door. His chair was empty, the cane gone. Luke felt something in his chest shift, small but sharp. He found him in the den, sitting in the recliner by the window, cane resting on his lap, eyes closed, not asleep, just still. "Morning," Luke said softly. Grandpa opened one eye, then the other, slow and deliberate. He looked over, nodded once. Luke stepped closer. Garage is locked. Grandpa's voice was gravel, quieter than usual. Didn't feel up to it today. Luke didn't ask why. He didn't press. He just stood there, waiting, hands in his pockets, heart trying to steady itself. After a few seconds, Grandpa motioned toward the hall. Box in the closet. Top shelf. Bring it out. Luke nodded and went. The hall closet smelled like old wood and mothballs. The box was heavy, taped shut. He carried it to the living room and set it on the coffee table. Grandpa tapped the lid once with his cane. Open it. Inside were tools, not the everyday ones. These were older, worn, familiar in a different way. A metal square with faded etching. A hand plane that still smelled faintly of cedar. A small level with air bubbles trapped in yellowed glass. Luke looked up. Grandpa said nothing. Just watched. These are yours, Luke said quietly. Were, Grandpa corrected. Luke didn't respond. He reached into the box and ran his fingers along the handle of the hand plane. The wood was smooth, dark with years of oil and grip. Grandpa leaned forward, resting both hands on his cane. Can't work like I used to. Not safe, not steady. Tools deserve better. Luke looked back at the box, then at his grandfather. They're not just tools. No, Grandpa said. They're not. Neither of them spoke for a while. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing leaves across the porch. A truck passed on the street, slow and rumbling. The clock in the kitchen ticked just loud enough to be noticed. I'll take care of them, Luke said finally. Grandpa nodded. That afternoon, Luke unlocked the garage himself. He turned on the lights, pulled off the cover from the workbench, opened the windows. He didn't build anything that day, didn't cut or sand or drill. He just cleaned, reorganized, wiped down surfaces, labeled a few drawers that had never had labels, made space on the pegboard for the new old tools. He left the hammer right where it had always hung. The shop felt different now. Not empty, just quiet in a way he hadn't felt before. Like the place itself was learning to rest. When he finished, he stood in the center of the garage and looked around. Everything in its place. Every surface swept. Every jar lined up just right. It wasn't Saturday, but it still felt like one. Luke showed up early that Saturday. The sky was still gray, morning dew clinging to the grass, and the air smelled like damp earth and cut lumber. He had blueprints rolled under his arm, a thermos of coffee in one hand, and a quiet weight in his chest that he couldn't quite shake. The treehouse plan had been sitting in his backpack for weeks. Not a kit, nothing prefab, just pencil-drawn lines on graph paper, notes scribbled in the margins, a sketch of a ladder, a railing, and a little window that faced the backyard. It wasn't for him. It was for his little brother, Matt, who'd been asking for one since spring. Luke had built a lot of things, but never something from the ground up. Never something this big. He could have tried it on his own, but he didn't want to. He wanted Grandpa. He knocked on the door of the house like he always had, then let himself in when no one answered. The kitchen was quiet, coffee half full in the pot, the cane resting by the fridge. He found Grandpa at the table, same spot as always, slowly tying the laces on his worn boots. Luke waited until he looked up. "I've got something," he said. Grandpa raised one eyebrow. "Tools or trouble?" Luke smiled. "Plans." He unrolled the paper on the table, flattened it with his hands. Grandpa leaned in, eyes scanning the lines without speaking. "Treehouse," Luke said. "Matt's been asking. I want to build it before school starts." Grandpa didn't nod, didn't comment on the measurements or the sketch. He just looked for a long moment, then said, "You lead." It was 2 words, but Luke felt them settle in his chest like an anchor. They didn't talk much on the way out to the yard. Grandpa moved slowly, one hand on the cane, the other on Luke's shoulder as they crossed the lawn. The spot Luke had picked was near the old maple, the one with the thick trunk and 3 low branches that stretched out like arms. He'd already hauled the lumber. 8-foot boards, pressure-treated, stacked neatly beside the tree. Grandpa eyed them once, then looked back at Luke. "You cut yet?" "No," Luke said. "Wanted to wait." Grandpa sat on the folding chair Luke had set up, pulled his jacket tight, rested both hands on the top of his cane. Luke laid the first board across the sawhorses. Measured. Cut. When the saw finished its pass, Grandpa didn't say a word, but he gave a small nod, barely noticeable. That was enough. They worked for 2 hours. Not fast, not non-stop. 3 boards on day 1, 4 screws, 1 bracket. Luke did the lifting, the climbing, the marking. Grandpa watched. Pointed when the angle wasn't right. Shook his head when Luke reached for the wrong bit. Held a beam steady when the ladder wobbled. He didn't give instructions. He gave presence. That afternoon, Luke handed him a bottle of water. Grandpa took it without looking, sipped, then said, "You remember the bench we built?" Luke nodded. "Crooked the first time." "Yeah." "You fixed it." Luke didn't answer. Just kept his eyes on the platform frame, squaring the corner, tightening the bolt. It was only the beginning. The structure barely stood, but the foundation was solid. Grandpa leaned back in his chair, his face calm but unreadable. Luke didn't ask how he was feeling, didn't ask if he wanted to stop. They both knew how to work through silence. The sun dipped lower, the shade stretched long across the yard. They packed up the tools together, slowly, without speaking. Back at the house, Grandpa rested one hand on Luke's shoulder before he went inside. Nothing dramatic, just weight and permission. Luke watched the door close, then turned back to the treehouse. Tomorrow, they'd add the ladder. He already knew how to build it, but he wanted Grandpa to watch anyway. They built it one slow Saturday at a time. Luke came early each weekend, boots muddy, sleeves rolled, carrying a clipboard with scribbled notes and measurements that kept changing. The treehouse was taking shape, but not fast. That wasn't the point. They averaged 3 boards a day. 4 if Grandpa was feeling steady. 2 if the wind picked up and made the ladder sway. Grandpa never climbed. He stayed grounded, seated in the same old folding chair near the base of the tree, a pencil tucked behind his ear, cane resting across his lap. He never said much, but when he did, it mattered. "That joist is shy. Refasten that bracket. Check your level again." And Luke would. Not because he didn't trust his own work, but because he respected the voice that had shaped his hands long before he understood what precision meant. Each Saturday followed the same rhythm. Luke unloaded the tools. Grandpa sipped coffee, slow and silent. They'd talk about weather, about wood grain, about the stubborn maple sap that stained every board they touched. Never about anything beyond the project. Never about what they were both feeling but didn't want to name. Grandpa's energy waned week by week. Luke noticed it in the way he reached for his thermos with 2 hands instead of 1, in the pauses between sentences, in the way his eyes stayed closed just a few seconds longer after each sip. But he still showed up. He still sat in that chair, cold or warm, rain or wind, and pointed out when Luke forgot to countersink a screw or when the overhang was 1/8 of an inch too wide. Luke stopped double-checking his measurements, started trusting himself more, started hearing Grandpa's voice in his head before the words ever came out loud. They reached the halfway point by the 3rd weekend, platform up, support rails in, ladder secured. The next step was the walls. That Saturday, Luke brought a fresh stack of plywood and a set of hinges for the trap door. Grandpa held a hinge in his hand, turning it slowly. "You're doing it right," he said. Luke looked up from his level. "Doing what?" "All of it." Luke didn't know how to respond. Grandpa set the hinge down on the edge of the toolbox and didn't say anything else for a while. That afternoon, they only got one wall framed before Grandpa said he was tired. Luke offered to finish the second one himself. Grandpa shook his head. "Next time." Luke nodded. They packed up the tools in silence. Luke swept the sawdust from the lawn while Grandpa folded his chair with slow, careful movements. He held the folded chair against his hip and looked up at the frame above them. "It'll hold," he said. Luke knew he meant more than the structure. The next morning, Luke returned alone. He wasn't planning to work, just wanted to look at it. The progress, the pieces coming together. He climbed the ladder slowly, stepped onto the platform, and sat on the edge with his legs dangling down. From there he could see the whole backyard, the tire swing, the shed, the line of worn fence posts leaning slightly to one side. He thought about all the Saturdays they'd spent out here, all the things they'd built. Some were still standing, some had been taken down long ago. But the lessons stayed. That was what Grandpa had been teaching him all along. Not just how to build things, but how to carry them, how to keep going, how to lead without needing to be followed. 3 boards a day, 4 if the weather held. That was enough. The hammer hit the ground before Luke even realized Grandpa had let it go. It didn't fall far, just slipped from his hand as he shifted in the folding chair. But the sound it made was sharp, sudden, louder than it should have been. It landed on the plywood near Luke's feet and bounced once before settling, handle facing the wrong way. Grandpa didn't move to pick it up. He just looked at it. Then he looked away. Luke set down the drill in his hand and reached for the hammer. He didn't speak. Just picked it up, wiped the sawdust from the grip, and hooked it on the side of his belt like he'd done 100 times before. Grandpa leaned back slowly, both hands resting on the arms of the chair, shoulders a little lower than usual. His face was unreadable. Not tired exactly, but distant. Watching the treehouse frame, the boards nailed straight, the crossbeams level. Luke crouched beside him. "You all right?" Grandpa nodded once. "Just old." Luke didn't press. He didn't say it was fine, or that they could stop, or that maybe they'd take a break. He just stood up and walked back to the ladder, gripping the hammer in one hand like it weighed more now than it had that morning. The rest of the day passed in slow, measured silence. They finished the second wall, got the frame up, braced it with 2 cross supports. Luke did most of the lifting. Grandpa watched with the same quiet intensity he always had, eyes narrowing when Luke paused, relaxing when the structure held. When it was time to pack up, Grandpa didn't stand. He just said, "Leave the rest." Luke nodded, gathered the tools, and left the sawhorses standing. He didn't sweep. He didn't put away the chair. He waited. That night, he sat in the half-finished treehouse long after the sun went down. The frame creaked softly in the wind. The walls cast long shadows under the glow of the back porch light. Below him, the yard was still, quiet, familiar. He held the hammer in his lap, fingers curled around the worn grip. It was the first tool Grandpa had ever let him use on his own. The same one that had framed a workbench, fixed a dozen fences, and knocked together the crooked birdhouse still hanging on the back fence. He looked down at it now and saw more than wood and metal. He saw every silent nod, every steady hand, every Saturday where nothing needed to be said. And now he knew. This wasn't just about age or energy or letting Luke take the lead. This was a handoff, not announced, not dramatic, just quiet, intentional, final. Grandpa hadn't dropped the hammer by accident. He had chosen to let it go. Luke sat there for a long time, the cool air brushing against his skin, the distant hum of traffic rolling in from the highway beyond the trees. He didn't cry, didn't speak, just sat. The next morning he found the chair folded by the garage door. No note, no message, just the empty space where Grandpa usually stood. Luke opened the garage, turned on the light, and put the hammer back on the wall. Then he reached for it again, and kept building. The garage door was already open when Luke arrived. That had never happened before. Not once in all the years of Saturdays, not even on the hot ones when Grandpa let the breeze in early, or on the stormy ones when they kept the tools packed just in case. The door was always shut until Luke knocked, until Grandpa was ready. Now it stood wide, sunlight pouring in across the floor, catching every speck of dust floating in the air like ash. Luke stepped inside. The lights were off, but it didn't matter. He knew where everything was. The smell hit him first. Old oil, wood shavings, time. The kind of scent that never really left a place, even when everything else changed. The bench was clean, every drawer shut, every clamp in place. It wasn't just tidy, it was emptied. On top of the workbench sat a folded cloth, neat, square, waiting. Beside it, an envelope. His name written across the front in Grandpa's uneven handwriting, sharp letters, slow curves, not shaking, but careful. Final. Luke stared at it for a long time before reaching out. He opened the envelope first. The note inside was short. Luke. The best way to teach is to show. You were always watching. I knew that. The hammer is yours now. You know how to use it. That's all I ever wanted. Don't stop building. G. Luke read it twice, then set it down on the workbench with both hands, flattening the page like it might try to curl away from him. He opened the cloth next. Inside was the hammer. The same one. Chipped handle. Black tape. Steel head dulled by years of use. The weight of it hadn't changed, but it felt heavier now in his hands. Not because of what it could do, but because of what it had already done. He stood there in the silence of the garage, holding the hammer, note beside him, cloth still half folded on the bench. There were no photos, no voice recordings, no long letters with memories scribbled in the margins. Just a tool, and the man who had used it to shape more than wood. Grandpa had never said much about life or legacy, never talked about what it meant to leave something behind. But Luke understood now. This was how he passed things on, not through words, but through action, through the quiet repetition of presence, through the space he'd made in a garage where a boy had once stood on a wooden crate just to reach the vise. Luke walked to the pegboard and hung the hammer on the same hook it had always lived on. Then he turned and looked at the garage again. It wasn't empty. It was ready. Later that afternoon, his mom called. There was no panic in her voice, just quiet, like she already knew Luke would understand. "Dad passed in his sleep," she said. "This morning. Peaceful." Luke didn't cry. Not right then. He just looked out the window at the fading light, at the sky that had turned pale with evening, and said, "Okay." There was no funeral. Grandpa hadn't wanted one. No speeches, no flowers. Just ashes scattered along the garden fence behind the house. The same one he'd reinforced with Luke when the corner post had rotted out. Luke stood beside it for a while after everyone else had gone, hands in his pockets, eyes on the ground. There were no grand stories to tell, no dramatic lessons, just work done right. and a hammer that still fit in his hand like it always had. The workshop stayed quiet for a few weeks. Luke still came by, usually on Saturdays, though not always in the morning. Sometimes he'd show up in the late afternoon, walk around the yard, sit in the garage without turning on the lights. The tools were still there, the workbench untouched, the hammer hanging in its place. Nothing was broken, but something had shifted. It was early April when he decided to go back in for real. Not to sit, not to remember, to work. He opened the garage door, tied his hair back, and swept the floor like Grandpa always had. Then he pulled the cord on the overhead light, let it flicker on, and rolled out the drawer with the measuring tape, the square, and the soft graphite pencils Grandpa had always used for marking cuts. He didn't have a specific project, but he knew where to start. The back shelves had been sagging for months. He and Grandpa had talked about rebuilding them back in the fall, but it never happened. They'd put it off in favor of the treehouse. It was time now. Luke took every jar down. Screws, nails, washers, drill bits. He labeled each one again, even the ones that already had names. The paint was faded. The handwriting deserved to last. He pulled out the warped shelves, replaced the brackets, cut new boards, sanded the edges smooth. Every motion was familiar. Muscle memory. He didn't second-guess himself anymore. Didn't look up for approval. He didn't need to. When the shelves were done, he cleaned the vise, re-oiled the hinges, rebuilt the small stool that had cracked last winter. He replaced the bulb above the window that never worked right and organized the scrap wood into proper bins. He wasn't doing it to stay busy. He was doing it because he knew how, and because someone had once shown him what it meant to take care of a space, to leave something better than you found it, to build with intention. Later that afternoon, Luke stepped back from the workbench and looked around the garage. The new shelves sat straight, every jar in place. The tools were lined up neatly. The air smelled like fresh sawdust again. It didn't feel like a museum. It felt like a shop again. That evening, Matt came by. Their mom had dropped him off for an overnight. He was 10 now, still small for his age, but curious and full of energy in the way younger brothers always seem to be when they want to be near the older ones they admire. Matt stood in the garage doorway, backpack slung over one shoulder. "Is it okay if I come in?" Luke nodded. "It's your shop, too." Matt walked over slowly, eyes scanning the room. He stopped in front of the hammer on the wall. "That was his, right?" Luke nodded. "Yeah." "Are you going to use it?" "I already have." Matt reached into his backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I drew up some treehouse decorations," he said. "Flags, a little pulley for snacks. You know, the important stuff." Luke smiled. "You want to build it this weekend?" Matt nodded quickly. Luke reached for the hammer and handed it to him. "Then let's get to work." They walked out to the yard together, plans in hand, laughter starting to fill the space that had been quiet for too long. The treehouse waited, still strong, still unfinished, just the way Grandpa would have left it. Luke finished the treehouse alone. It wasn't planned that way. Matt had helped with the little things, painting the railings, tying a pulley system to the side post, hanging a plastic flag they'd cut from an old tarp. But the final boards, the last corner of the roof, the trim around the window, those came later, quietly, one piece at a time. He worked in the evenings, mostly, after classes, after his shift at the hardware store. He'd park behind the house, change into old jeans, and walk across the yard with the hammer in his hand and sawdust already clinging to his shirt. It came together faster than he expected. By mid-May, the structure was solid. The ladder sturdy, the floorboards level. The window looked out over the back fence, just far enough to catch the sun dipping low across the field. The final nail went in on a Thursday. He didn't tell anyone it was done. That weekend, Matt found it for himself. Luke had been inside the garage, reorganizing the tool rack, when he heard the ladder creak. A few seconds later, Matt's voice echoed down from the platform. "Hey, Luke?" Luke stepped outside and looked up. Matt was standing at the open window, hands on the ledge, eyes wide. "It feels safe up here," he said. Luke didn't answer right away. He walked across the yard, placed a hand on the ladder, and looked up at the treehouse they had built. Every corner square, every board sealed, every line exactly where it was meant to be. He nodded once. That was enough. Matt disappeared into the doorway, footsteps echoing softly above. Luke stayed on the ground. The breeze moved through the yard. The maple leaves rustled like quiet applause. The sun filtered through the branches and cast long shadows across the grass. And for the first time since the project began, Luke didn't feel like something was missing. He felt like something had been passed on. The tools were still in the garage. The hammer still hung on its hook when it wasn't in use. The bench was still clean, the jars still labeled. But Luke had stopped thinking of the space as Grandpa's. Now it was theirs. A place to build, to teach, to remember. The following week, Luke brought out a folding chair. Not the old one Grandpa used. He'd never moved it from the garage. But a new one. Plain. Simple. He set it in the shade of the tree and sat down, looking up at the tree house as Matt leaned out the window and tossed down a rope tied to a tin can full of crackers. Luke caught it and smiled. No words were needed. That was the last lesson. Not the hammer or the measurements or the perfect joints. It was the silence. The kind that lets you figure it out for yourself. The kind that stays long after the person is gone. Luke leaned back in the chair, the rope still in his hand, and let the afternoon settle around him. He had built something that would last, and he hadn't done it alone. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this, we'd love to have you as a subscriber.